Truth. Mark Dankoff joins us from San Antonio, Texas, and we have Middle East Affairs expert Patrick Seal, who joins us from Cannes. Gentlemen, welcome. I'd like to start with you, Patrick Seal. We have German intelligence that is saying Al-Qaeda is all over Syria, that around 90 terror attacks that can be attributed to Al-Qaeda, and that's fascinating, between the end of December and the beginning of July. And that's almost, 7 months there. It's called U.S. proxy Al-Qaeda death squads in Syria. Your reaction?
Well, there's no doubt that the conflict has widened, and that the local Islamist Muslim brothers have now got lots of allies from outside. These jihadis you mentioned, or Salafis, armed Islamists, coming in, mainly from Iraq, but also from Lebanon, some from Jordan, and some, as you say, from further afield. This, of course, the hallmark of these people is suicide bombings, and there have been quite a few of those. Whether the figure quoted by the German intelligence is correct or not, in any event, there are quite a lot of them, and they have, in a way, changed the nature of this conflict, because, as one of your other guests said a moment ago, it puts the United States and its allies in a rather embarrassing situation. They're fighting Al-Qaeda in many, many countries, and here they seem to be on the same side of it. And so I think they're quite well aware of the difficulty of their position, and so they're trying to filter the weapons and funds and intelligence they're sending in, and they're trying not to send them to these jihadi groups. But that's, of course, very, very difficult, because there are about 100 of these armed groups. It's very difficult to say which are Islamists, which are not, which are simply armed peasants or unemployed youth, or which are these Salafi fighters. So it does put the West in a very, very difficult position. But what I think we're increasingly seeing is that the internal crisis in Syria is overshadowed, as you mentioned, I think, overshadowed by this regional conflict, a sort of mini Cold War between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and Russia, China, Iran on the other, who of course are trying to protect the Syrian regime, which they feel is facing an external conspiracy.
Mark Dankoff, let's bring in Turkey, which has been reported to set up a secret base, a nerve, what is called a nerve center of sorts, with allies Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to direct military and communications aid to these so-called fighters who are fighting the government from a city near the border. Do you agree that it's the Turks who are militarily controlling it, with Qatar and Saudi Arabia at the bottom?
Probably. I mean, that's probably for someone with more intelligence information than I have as to exactly what the leading military force is from the outside, probably Turkish. But I think the best explanation to us in the West as to what's really going on here comes from Charlie Skelton's piece in the British Guardian on the Syrian opposition. He analyzes the connections of a number of these people connected with the so-called Syrian National Council, which claims to be the spokespeople for all of the opposition to President Assad. Skelton analyzes these people, including someone by the name of Basma Kodmani, kind of the claimed head of the Syrian National Council. Here is a person who is based in Paris. She's a French citizen. She attended the secretive Bilderberg Conference in Chantilly, Virginia, held here in the United States recently. She is someone who is the executive director of something called the Arab Reform Initiative, or ARI, which is the creation of something called the U.S. Middle East Project, which in turn is an operation being run by the Globalist Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, right here in New York. She's directly connected to General Brent Scowcroft, to Henry Kissinger, to Zbigniew Brzezinski, to Lord Kerr of Royal Dutch Shell. She's tied up with George Soros. She's tied up with Peter Sutherland of Goldman Sachs. She's tied up with all of the usual suspects, which point in the direction of Zionism, international banking, oil consortiums, and arms dealers. And these are the folks who want to get rid of President Assad in Syria and pave the way for an American and Israeli military intervention against Iran. And one key way of doing that is to remove a key supporter of Iran in the Arab world, to exacerbate the tensions between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, and to basically undercut both Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to remove a major supporter of Palestinian resistance against ongoing Israeli occupation. This is what's happening here, and people like Anderson Cooper of CNN and Wolf Blitzer of CNN and these people being directed by Rupert Murdoch of Fox News are telling the American public none of this, and we're being led to believe that President Assad is just practically the worst leader in world history, and that we have to get rid of him at all costs. And the stage is being set for another version of what happened in Libya, with NATO and the United States and Israel and Britain being directly involved, and again, as a prelude to a wider war with Iran, which is what Netanyahu wants. It's what the oil companies want, it's what the banks want, and it's what the arms dealers want. And the Syrian National Council people are working hand in glove with Israel, with the Sunni Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. They're working with Turkey, and ironically enough, they're working with Al-Qaeda too.
And that is ironic, isn't it, Patrick Seal? But let's expand more about Turkey here. I'd like to find out from you that Turkey's President Erdogan came out with a warning, and it said that he may take action against the Kurdish rebels operating in the north of Syria. Do you think that this is going to lead to a perhaps Turkish and NATO intervention into Syria?
I personally don't think so. There isn't really any appetite, either in Turkey or in any of the Western countries, and certainly not in the United States, to get physically involved in the conflict inside Syria, to put boots on the ground. Nobody wants that. What they're trying to do is beef up the rebels, beef up the Free Syrian Army, so-called, with, of course, all these jihadis attached to it. Now, as I said earlier, this puts them in a rather embarrassing situation. But there's no doubt that the final goal, the objective, is to bring down the whole so-called resistance axis of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. I mean, what the United States would really like to do is to bring down the two regimes in Tehran and Damascus. And this, of course, is what the Israelis are pushing them to do. Just as they pushed them to destroy Iraq, so they would like to push them to destroy Iran. And of course, if they can bring down the Syrian regime first, they feel this would sever Iran's links with the Levant, with the Palestinians, with Hezbollah in particular. The Israelis have tried to destroy Hezbollah in 2006. They tried to destroy Hamas in 2008 and 2009. They failed on both counts. Now they see a chance to bring down that whole axis, but without actually getting involved themselves. This is the paradox. That's why they're trying to strengthen the rebels, providing them with intelligence, with communications equipment, with weapons, and trying to get them more organized than they have been in the past. Because a feature of the present situation is, of course, the great divisions in the opposition. I mean, one of your speakers a moment ago mentioned Basma Kudmani. But of course, she's a million miles away from these Salafists. She's a completely different personality. Her aims are different. But of course, her organization, the Syrian National Council, has provided cover for these rather more violent elements. And this is her dilemma as well. The fundamentals of the situation have not really changed, in my view. First of all, I think the regime retains the political supremacy in a way. The balance of power is still very much, military balance of power is still very much in the regime's favor. Secondly, Syria continues to enjoy the protection of Russia and China at the Security Council. Thirdly, I think, as I said, there's no appetite anywhere in the West after these many wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, with the economic cuts and troop cuts in countries like Britain and France. There's no appetite for an intervention. And fourthly, of course, the opposition, as I say, is divided. They haven't united behind a single leader. They haven't provided a clear political program. And they are being overshadowed now by the Muslim Brothers in Syria, which is the strongest element in the opposition, together with these Salafi allies of it. So this is the difficult situation in which the opponents of the Syrian regime and of Iran find themselves.
Right. Well, let me bring in Kevin Barrett. He's an author and Islamic studies expert who joins us from Madison. Kevin Barrett, our guest there from Cannes, Patrick Seal, talked about the divided opposition. At the same time, we know the different elements that are involved in this so-called fighters on the ground, which have been cited to be of different nationalities, including Libya, Egypt, and Jordan. Not to have a strong grip on that either. These Western countries, such as the U.S., UK, and France, for example, being funded by Turkey, by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and of course Turkey being the training ground. Let's reflect on Russian President Putin, who has said if the Syrian leadership is ousted from power by unconstitutional means, the leadership and the opposition will trade places, and this war is going to continue. So how is this situation even remotely under the control of these countries who are involved in it?
Are you asking me that?
No, this is for Kevin Barrett.
Well, the situation is really not in very good control. Yes, well, it's an honor, actually, to be on the same show with Patrick Seal, one of my favorite Mideast experts. I've been reading him since graduate school. And I appreciate particularly that Patrick has been so honest about the fact that false flag terrorism is an important element, especially in Israeli Middle East strategy. But and what he just said about the incongruity of al-Qaeda and the Western globalists and Zionists sort of working on the same team in Syria to destabilize the Syrian government, I think it's not as incongruous as it looks at first glance. If you accept the official Western narrative that al-Qaeda is indeed an autonomous radical Islamic group that just sort of appeared out of nowhere and turned against the U.S. after a brief alliance in Afghanistan and so on, then it would seem incongruous. But I believe that al-Qaeda is more or less an invention of the Western intelligence services. Bernard Lewis has devoted much of his career to the idea that the West ought to create a modern version of the Ismaili assassins who destabilized the Middle East during the Middle Ages, the time of the Crusades. And I think that's what al-Qaeda really is. It was created with the help of the U.S. intelligence services and their proxies in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And I think it's always been a proxy of the U.S. intelligence services, including when it falsely accepted the blame for 9/11, which was a military intelligence operation carried out by the U.S. and Israel. So it's not at all surprising that so-called al-Qaeda is in Syria doing the bidding of the Western imperialists and globalists and Zionists. That's what they do. That's their job. And certainly the foot soldiers on the ground are not aware of this. But some of the leadership is. Al-Qaeda leaders have been arrested in places like Turkey and in jail. They're not fasting during Ramadan. They want alcohol. The jailers ask, well, what's going on? We thought you were radical Islamists. And these guys say, oh, no, we're just working on part of a strategy of tension. Strategy of tension, of course, being a euphemism for false flag terrorism sponsored by these Western governments, sponsoring attacks on themselves. So that leads us to your question about what's the end game of all of this? Where can it possibly go? I think that the only end game in Syria is perpetual civil war. And Syria looks like it could fragment into all of these different sectarian and confessional communities. And that's exactly what the Zionists and the imperialists want. So by fomenting this unrest in Syria, what they're really doing is intentionally destroying Syria in the same way that they largely destroyed Iraq, and they're taking it out of the equation as an opponent of Zionism and imperialism. And as Patrick Seal said, they want to take out this whole axis of resistance of Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah.
Mark Dankoff, so am I to understand